can beat this mental illness thing. It's a struggle, and heaven knows I've struggled too. But with the right help, you can get better, and help is on its way soon. So put that knife down, please. There was no reply. But then Jane heard a deep sob, and the knife clattered to the floor as Deanna let it drop. A cold hand reached out and touched Jane's fingers. Will you stay with me? Jane took her hand in hers and held it. Of course I will, she said. Whiskey likes you, I think. That's unusual for him. He doesn't normally like strangers. Mrs. Mortimer had finished making the phone call and now stood in her tiny sitting room, watching the little girl huddled on the sofa. Whiskey had jumped straight onto her lap and settled down there. Emily froze with fear at first, but then began gently to stroke the cat's soft fur. Whiskey purred under her touch. Shall I make you a drink? Hot chocolate, perhaps? Mrs. Mortimer said. But Emily hung her head and didn't speak. Don't be scared. Everything will be all right, I'm sure. Even as she said the words, Mrs. Mortimer realised she was trying to reassure herself as well. There was no sound at all from next door, and that wasn't necessarily a good sign. Mrs. Mortimer spoke again. If you don't want to talk to me, perhaps you can talk to Whiskey. Cats understand more than folk think they can, and I can tell you what Whiskey would say to you if cats could speak. The little girl nodded. She spoke at last. Whiskey, is my daddy coming to take me home? Mrs. Mortimer put her head on one side, as if listening to the cat's low purr. He says, yes. Mrs. Mortimer, that's me, just rang the police. Your daddy has told them you were missing, and they've been trying to find you. They're on their way. Will Mummy be all right? Are they going to take her away to the hospital again? Yes, I expect they'll take your Mammy somewhere safe. Look after her. And the other lady, I think her name is Jane. Yes, I'm sure she'll be all right as well. You know her, do you? Oh, yes. I've seen her lots of times. At night, in my flying dreams, I tried to tell her. Your flying dreams? I came here. I saw her. I saw the cushion. It was over my face. And then we were in the dark and under the water, and it was cold, so cold. The child covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders were trembling. Mrs. Mortimer had no idea what the child was talking about, and she didn't know how to comfort her. So she sat down beside her and laid a hand on her shoulder. The room filled with the beam of car headlights coming down the track. They're here, Hinny. You're safe now, she said. Epilogue. It was a beautiful September morning. Rays of sunlight danced in sparkling bursts on the sea's smooth surface under a cloudless blue sky. Do you know, it must almost be exactly a year to the day we first arrived here, Peter said. He and Jane were walking down the track towards the cottage, having parked the car at the top next to the farm gate. Maxim, just 3 weeks old, was asleep in the sling, his tiny head lolling against Peter's chest, a slight breeze ruffling the fluffy tufts of auburn baby hair. Don't suppose much has changed, said Jane. She had been quite happy about coming back, but as they rounded the bend, she felt again the cold, uneasy feeling she remembered from that first arrival a year ago. Peter noticed her sudden shudder. Are you all right? He said, looking at her in the way he often did since the events of last December, a look of concern, but mingled with a tinge of something else. Fear, perhaps. Or was it more a kind of puzzled wonderment, as if he was trying to figure out something about her that he knew he never could? Yes, fine, she said, and as the cottage came into view, she laughed. Oh, I was wrong. Looks like things have changed a bit. The cottage was surrounded with scaffolding and ladders and building materials, piles of stones and lengths of timber, heaped around, the grass churned up with mud. Blackwood will be knocking down the dividing wall and turning it back into one large property, I expect. Room for more holidaymakers. Lots more cash in the kitty, said Peter. Jane smiled to herself. He never had warmed to Nigel. They looked up to the cliff top where they'd all agreed to meet. There was Nigel, large and jovial as ever, holding a cardboard box in his arms. Mr. and Mrs. Armstrong from the farm were there too. They gathered round Jane and Peter as they approached, focusing on baby Maxim, oohing and ahhing in the expected fashion at his small perfection. "It's a pity," said Brian Armstrong. "There's not many of us here to say goodbye to poor Peggy." "Well," Nigel said, nodding towards the cardboard box he held. "It's what she wanted. No fuss, no funeral. I would have thought her sister might have turned up, but apparently she's away on a Caribbean cruise." "But looks like someone else is coming," Jane said, pointing to a car just drawing up at the cottage. And when the occupants got out, she saw who it was. Emily had grown taller, filled out, and looked altogether less frail, less waif-like than Jane remembered. Her long blonde hair was a little darker and had been cut in a neat bob. Holding her hand was James Bailey, her father, bearded, fair-haired, smiling. "I had to come today," he explained. "We owe a lot to that lady's courage. And yours, of course, Jane. I didn't really think Emily should come. I thought it might stir up too many traumatic memories for her. But you insisted, didn't you, Em?" She smiled shyly and squeezed her father's hand. "Well, there's a few more of us now to see her off," Nigel said. "And we've done everything she asked. Except for one thing, eh, Emily?"
"Whiskey?"
the girl said, brightening up.
"He's my cat now."
"Peggy left written instructions he was to be put to sleep when she went," Nigel explained. "But Emily and that cat took a shine to each other, so, well, it seemed obvious she should have him. I spoke to Peggy about it just before she went into the hospice, and she was happy with that." "Well, let's get on with the job in hand," Nigel said, lifting a bulging plastic bag out of the box. "I know it doesn't look quite proper, but Peggy wouldn't have wanted money wasted on some fancy urn. So, here she is. Let's take her to the cliff edge, shall we?" As they walked across the rough, grassy slope, Jane spoke to Emily's father.
"How is Deanna? I did go to see her a few times in the hospital, but last time I went they said she'd been discharged, and with the baby and everything, I've been a bit busy these last few weeks."
"Oh, I know you have, and I'm really grateful. The way you befriended her, it helped her a lot, I think. She's way better now. They've sorted out the right meds. She hasn't had one of her episodes in months, and she's living down in Sussex with her parents. Emily gets to Zoom call her regularly. And maybe we'll try a visit when she's ready for it. Supervised, of course."
Jane wanted to ask more, but Nigel handed the plastic bag to her and said,
"I think you should do this, Jane."
The bag was surprisingly full and heavy and difficult to handle as she tilted it over the cliff edge and shook out the contents. The coarse, gritty ashes dribbled out in a rush, too quickly, but a sudden sea breeze caught them and held them in a dense grey cloud for a moment, before they scattered and floated down to the foaming waves below. "Goodbye, Mrs. Mortimer," Jane said. "Rest in peace, wherever you are." Where and what Peggy was, where and what Angela was, and Nan, she didn't know and would never know. But that was all right. Perhaps there were just some things none of us were meant to understand. Maxim had woken up, and his thin wails joined the cries of the gulls wheeling overhead. Jane felt the sting of milk filling her breasts.
"Now that's over, are you coming up to the farm for a brew and some cake?" Mrs. Armstrong said. "We'd love to, but no, thanks," Jane said. "The baby needs feeding. Better get home."
Peter and Jane walked back up the track. Just before the bend, Jane paused to turn and take a last look at the cottage. Standing still as statues in the middle of the field and facing towards her were two people. A man, muscular, bare-chested, long shaggy hair, and a young woman, plump with yellow hair, wearing a short denim skirt. There was something about their stillness and the hazy mist surrounding them that seemed odd. They were staring straight at her. As she stared back, the man slowly raised his hand, as if in greeting. Peter had walked on some way ahead. She turned and called out to him. "Peter?"
"What's the matter?"
But when she looked again, nobody was there. There was nothing in the field but the grass and weeds and a couple of grazing sheep. Maxim's wails were becoming more persistent now.
"Oh, it's all right. I just thought—" "It's nothing," she said, hurrying to catch Peter and the baby up. She decided she wouldn't tell him what she'd seen, and she wouldn't look back at the cottage again. You've been listening to Don't Leave by Pru Heathcote, narrated by Melanie Crawley. Published by Clipper Audiobooks, an imprint of W.F. Howes Limited. This work is copyrighted 2020 Pru Heathcote. This recording is copyrighted 2022 W.F. Howes Limited.